Hey guys, welcome to Beklaedt's YouTube channel. If you are new to this channel, then please hit the subscribe button so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks and much more. My name is Iben, and in today's video I'll show you how I sew my bias cut dress Tidsel. This dress is very elegant, even though it's actually very simple to make. The fabric has been cut on the bias, which gives a beautiful drape and a comfortable fit. The front of the dress is made with a cowl neck, which adds shape to the bust. The dress is fully lined. This sexy dress is a quick sewing project because it's constructed with a limited amount of seams. You can buy the sewing pattern for this dress on my website, Beklaedt.com. Alright, let's get going. I'm using this satin weave silk from Tidsel. The fabric has a little bit of elastane, which gives it stretch along the width. But that's not something you need for this design. The most important thing is that the fabric has natural stretch on the bias, which means the fabric should have elasticity if you pull on the bias. You can use other materials than silk, for example viscose or polyester, as long as the fabric has heavy drape. I use a plain weave lining in acetate. The lining is also cut on the bias, so it's important that the lining has stretch on the bias as well. To stabilize the armholes and the back seam, I use a light fusible interfacing. We also need matching thread. As well as sharp microtex needles. If you don't have these types of needles, then make sure to use a new needle for this project. Lastly, we need a small button for the closure at the neck. When cutting on the bias, you should only cut through one layer at a time. Place the fabric on a large surface. If your table isn't big enough, you can use the floor. Smooth out all wrinkles and make sure that nothing is pulling at the fabric. Place the pattern piece on the fabric so it lays on the bias, which means that the fabric piece has been pivoted 45 degrees relative to the grain line. You can use the arrows on the pattern piece as navigation. Take your time doing this so you make sure the pattern piece lays correctly before cutting out the fabric. I recommend using pattern weights instead of pins, as pins have a tendency of pulling at the fabric. Books can be used as pattern weights. I only cut with a 1 cm seam allowance, which is included in the pattern, as I want to finish the dress with regular seams. But you can choose to make French seams if you want to. If so, I recommend watching my other video for sewing the skirt Beklaedt. The two front pieces should be rotated 45 degrees to one side, while the 3 back pieces should be rotated 45 degrees to the other side. It's quite important that you remember to rotate the pieces to either side to prevent the dress from twisting around your body. The bottom skirt piece is cut twice, one time for the front and one time for the back. Please remember to make the back skirt a mirror image of the front skirt. Take an extra look at the cutting guide if you are in doubt. The lining is cut the same way as the outer fabric. But you should cut the lining as mirror images of the outer fabric, unless your lining has an identical right and wrong side, in which case it doesn't matter. I start by ironing on interfacing along each armhole. I've cut a piece of interfacing on the bias, which is 2 to 3 cm wide, to maintain the elasticity of the fabric. I also iron on interfacing to the center back seams. As you can see, I've prepared each pattern piece by overlocking along the side seams, back seams and the diagonal seams. But if you don't have an overlocker, you can finish the seams with a zigzag stitch or by making French seams. Place the two back pieces on top of each other, right sides together, and place pins along the back seam. It's important not to pull at the fabric while adding pins, as you can end up with a crooked seam in the end. Place the pieces flat on the table and place pins up until you reach the notch, which marks the beginning of the back opening. Stitch the pieces together using a 1 cm seam allowance. When sewing, you should again make sure that nothing is pulling at the fabric. Your job is to guide the fabric through the sewing machine as gently as possible. Finish by pressing open the seam with your iron. Place the front skirt against the front piece, right sides together, and place pins along the diagonal edge. Stitch the pieces together. Finish by pressing the seam open with your iron. Place the back skirt against the back pieces, right sides together, and place pins along the diagonal edge. Stitch the pieces together and split the seam open. Repeat these steps for the lining pieces, but it's quite important to place the lining as mirror images of the front dress when you add pins. You'll see why this is important in the next step. Stitch the seams on the lining and press the seams open. Cut a piece which is 2 cm wide and about 10 cm long from a piece of scrap fabric. This piece should also be cut on the bias. Pull out a long thread from the sewing machine. Make a couple of stitches next to the upper edge of your fabric piece. Place the long piece of sewing thread inside the fabric piece and fold it right sides together lengthwise. Make a stitch down the fabric piece by stitching approximately 5 mm from the edge. With one hand, pull the threads towards you while you, with your other hand, maintain a light hold on the fabric. By doing this, we are able to turn the fabric around. Place the finished back piece in the outer fabric on top of the back lining, right sides together. Match the notch at the back seam with each other and place a pin at the exact point where the stitching meet. We are going to stitch the pieces together by the neckline, so you should also add pins here. Place the small loop in between the outer fabric and the lining on one of the back pieces, approximately 1 cm below the neckline. The size of the loop depends on the size of your button. Please remember that the loop faces inwards while the two legs faces out towards the seam allowance. I also add pins along either armhole. Stitch the lining and outer fabric together by the neckline and back opening. Finish your seam in the exact point where we placed a pin. Do the same on the other side. You can stitch twice over the loop to make sure it is tightly secured. I also stitched the lining and the outer fabric together at the armholes. Snip small indents into the seam allowance along the curved edge on the armhole and neckline, but remember to not cut through the seam. Turn the pieces around so the right side is facing up and press all the seams with your iron. Now it's time to gather the two fronts. Place the front piece in the outer fabric on top of the lining, right sides together, and place pins along the curved edge. You should match the center front on the outer fabric with the center front on the lining. Stitch the pieces together. And split the seams open with your iron. Turn the pieces around so the right side is facing inwards and place pins along the armholes. Stitch the pieces together by the armholes. Snip into the seam allowance at the armholes. Turn the pieces around so the right side is facing up and press the seam flat. Make a little stitch along the shoulder seam on the front piece 5 mm from the edge. Now we need to gather the shoulder seams on the front and back pieces. Place the pieces flat on the table. I start by placing a pin on the front neckline, which marks the length of the shoulder seam when we subtract the seam allowance. Then I push my right hand through both layers on the back of the dress and out through the shoulder seam. I get a hold of the shoulder seam on the front pieces, which I then pull back through the hole on the shoulder. Add pins along the shoulder seam. Take your time doing this, as it can be a little tricky to get the layers to lay correctly, but hopefully the pin we added before can be of some help. Stitch the shoulder seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. I know it can be difficult to get the front pieces aligned with the back piece. If you can't make it happen, then I suggest to make a second stitch at the neckline right next to the first one, which aligns completely with the front piece. This is by far the easiest solution, rather than ripping the pieces apart and starting again, and no one can tell the difference. Now we need to finish the side seams. Pull the lining and outer fabric away from each other and place the layers so the back piece of the outer fabric is laying next to the front piece in the outer fabric, right sides together. Place pins along the side seam all the way up till the armhole and down the lining side. On the armhole, you should press the seam allowance towards the lining. Make sure to match the diagonal seams with each other along the way. stitch the side seam as one continuous stitch. I start by the bottom edge of the dress in the outer fabric, stitch up towards the armhole, stitch over the armhole and down the side seam of the lining. Finish by pressing the side seam open with your iron. Now we need to hem the dress. I press the hemline on the lining 2 centimeters towards the wrong side. Then I fold the lining another 2 centimeters towards the wrong side and press again. Depending on how your lining sits relative to your outer fabric, you might need to trim the lining before hemming it. A suggestion would be to trim the lining by 2 centimeters beforehand. I recommend that the lining is at least 2.5 centimeters shorter than the outer fabric when both layers have been hemmed. Stitch the hem in place a couple of millimeters from the edge. The hemline on the outer fabric is finished by ironing the bottom edge 1 centimeter towards the wrong side all around the dress. Then make a stitch approximately 2 millimeters from the edge. Trim away 4 to 5 millimeters of the hem all around. After which the hemline is folded approximately 4 millimeters towards the wrong side. Press with your iron. This means the stitching we just did is laying in the middle of the hemline. I stitch the hem in place from the right side with a new stitch that again lays about 2 millimeters from the edge. When you make this stitch, it's important to let the fabric glide naturally through the machine. Let your sewing machine do the work, while you only guide the fabric through. Last thing to do is to add a button to the neck on the other side relative to the loop. Great work! The dress is finished and ready to take a spin on the dance floor. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, then please give it a like. You are also more than welcome to share it with your friends. Please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks, and much more. Bye now!